What's up, motivators? Taren here. Today we are going to talk about heart rate, power, pace, rate of perceived exertion, what you should use when, and how you should ease into using one versus the other, whether you are a beginner athlete, an intermediate, or an advanced, to make sure that you're saving money and you're actually adapting to the workouts in such a way that you are becoming a better athlete over time. Let's do it.
My name is Taren Gazelle. In my 20s, I was overweight, unfulfilled, and couldn't even run to the end of the block. Over the following years, I found endurance sports, lost 65 pounds, won age groups, raced world championships, broke records, and trained and learned from some of the best athletes and coaches in the world. You too can use endurance sports to change your life and accomplish your fitness goals. You just need a system that's meant for us amateurs who want to be our best while feeling our strongest and healthiest. My company Motive offers that system, and I want to share some of the tips from it today.
So motivators, thank you for tuning in. When I first got into endurance sports, I found myself fairly confused by whether I should be using heart rate or power. Did I even need power pedals on my bike? Should I be using pace? Should I just be going by feel all the time and rate of perceived exertion? And it was really confusing. Fact of the matter is that sometimes heart rate is better, sometimes rate of perceived exertion is better, sometimes power is better, but it's also sometimes not necessary. What we've actually just done, shameless plug for our app, but we've been getting really good feedback on it, so I wanted to share it here with you, is we have incorporated into all of our workouts what you should use when. So for example, this bike workout, in the warm-up, it's based off rate of perceived exertion. The main set is done by power. And then the cool down is, again, really no guidance, just an easy cool down. And then go to an intense run, there's a mixture of everything, just an easy warm-up jog. And then there is pace-based intervals. There's, again, rate of perceived exertion with easy cool down. And then we look to the main run, this is typically going to be based off of heart rate. What we're finding with the feedback from our athletes is that it's very good because they know what to use when. We want to make sure that if you're watching this and whether you're using our app or not, you are going to be able to understand what to use when. And we're going to base it off of the understanding that you need your low intensity training to build up your endurance. You need a fair amount of top end training to build up your top end speed. And then you need to be comfortable at race pace. I'm going to add on a couple of things that aren't typically discussed, but I think are very important is, number one, it needs to be cost effective. I can't just say go and buy $5,000 worth of metrics gear and force you to do lactate testing, getting into a lab and doing a bunch of metabolic cart testing. Again, not practical for beginner athletes. We want to make sure that what we prescribe is accessible for the average person so that everyone can actually do endurance sports. It needs to be done in such a way that it teaches you how to be a better athlete. I think if we just say, you know what, we are going to strictly use metrics all the time and you don't have to think your way through it, it's not teaching you to be a better athlete, and it might actually lead to some blow-ups on race day. So let's go through a bunch of different scenarios and which metrics we actually use when. Let's start off with some different types of training for the different types of races and divide it up between low intensity, race effort, top end, and top end short. Top end long is like 1 minute to 8 minutes. Top end short is about 15 seconds to 60 seconds. For the low intensity, we look primarily at heart rate besides the swim, which is done off rate of perceived exertion, a little bit of thinking. Why we use heart rate exclusively for low intensity is because other metrics kind of lie. Heart rate is a really nice hard and fast number that you can use that adjusts based on how you're feeling. If you're not feeling really well, your heart rate's going to climb a little bit extra and your pace and power are going to naturally adjust. Same thing if you're in hot weather or cold weather, it's going to be a little bit less taxing for the cold weather, a little bit more taxing for the hot weather, and your heart rate will naturally adjust. So it's always going to make sure that you are in low intensity. Race effort, well, this is a bit of a question mark. Really what I like to use for race effort guidance for all of your race effort specific intervals, it depends on what measure you are going to be using in the race to dictate your race effort. For a sprint and Olympic, quite often this is rate of perceived exertion. For 5 and 10K and halves, same sort of thing, rate of perceived exertion. But for longer distance races like 70.3 Ironman, Marathons, we're looking at pace and power, a little bit more hard and fast numbers, whereas an ultra race tends to be a little bit more heart rate, but also rate of perceived exertion. You really have to understand your body. For a cycling road race, well, it's kind of going to be irrelevant because a lot of the efforts are more similar to your intervals, and the spikes and valleys in a road race for cycling are a little bit different. Grand Fondo and Ultra, probably a little bit more heart rate and the combination of. So more than anything, your race-based efforts are dictated by what the metric is that you're going to use on race day. Your top end long, I like to use pace and power numbers because it's going to give you a hard number that can push you a little bit. The purpose of those long efforts is to actually really push yourself to the limit. And if we have a number that inherently pushes us to the limit, when we start fading towards the end of the workout, we're going to be motivated to stay in that number. Flip side of that is that the top end short, those ballistic 15 to 60 second intervals, because they're so ballistic and we aren't really able to even look down at a metric, we're going to use more rate of perceived exertion. Why we use rate of perceived exertion exclusively in the swim? Because, well, heart rate is going to be very inaccurate because the hydrostatic pressure of the water around your body is going to artificially lower your heart rate. Power, there really is no power that you're going to be able to do. Pace is actually a really good metric, but you're not going to be able to use pace in any of your races. So I like to develop the ability for an athlete to understand what the pace clock says in combination with what their perceived exertion is and start dialing that in. And when you start getting really good, you can actually use your rate of perceived exertion almost as accurately as a pace clock. Let's look at this a different way to hopefully help you continue to understand it. If we're looking at those ballistic 15 to 60 second intervals, well, we don't want to use heart rate because it's going to take more than 60 seconds for our heart rate to catch up to that interval. Power, again, you know what, we can possibly use it, but if it's really ballistic, well, you're not even going to want to look at power. Rate of perceived exertion, this is what I like. Just go really hard. We're looking at going quite difficult. Pace, same sort of thing. You might not even want to look at pace. For the 1 to 8 minute intervals, as we discussed, power and pace are the preferred methods. Rate of perceived exertion, if you develop a really good sense of your pace and your power numbers over the course of years, you could use this, but it's going to take some time to develop that self-awareness as an athlete. Heart rate, again, I don't like using that for these because it's going to take anywhere from about 3 to 4 minutes for your heart rate to actually catch up. The 10 to 60 minute, these are tempo-based intervals, these are race pace type intervals. Well, sometimes you use heart rate if that's what you're going to use on your race, but I really like power and pace. How I actually like to do these intervals is use power and pace as the first metric, and then look back after the workout and see what my heart rate is. And then when you get into the race, actually prefer to use heart rate so that we're looking at the hard target number first, but then backing out what the heart rate number was during those intervals so that if we go to a race and we've traveled or we've really absorbed the taper very well or we've absorbed it poorly, we can actually have a secondary metric of, you know what, saying I know my target race power or pace was X, but I'm just not feeling it or I'm feeling it really well, and you can fall back on heart rate, which is going to adjust a little bit easier for race day. Rate of perceived exertion, actually, this is where you ideally want to get to as a very, very sophisticated athlete. Just takes a long time for you to get there. For the endurance-based stuff, this is the long, low-intensity stuff. I really like heart rate because, in my opinion, this is what's going to teach the average new athlete what low intensity feels like. In studies, what we've seen is when people aren't using a hard and fast number like heart rate, they tend to lie to themselves and they say, oh, well, 430 per kilometer pace, that's my easy pace because I can do it for a long period of time. Or rate of perceived exertion, it felt very easy. And more often than not, when people use these numbers here, power, rate of perceived exertion, pace, they actually end up being about 15 beats per minute or about 5 to 10% over their low intensity threshold. Finally, let's look at some different scenarios because we get a lot of what ifs about this. Well, let's start with the warm up. I really like heart rate or rate of perceived exertion because at the start of a workout, you want to ease into understanding how you're feeling that day. If we say, all right, you got to hit a certain power or a certain pace right off the bat, you don't know what you're actually capable of on that day, so it might not be so accurate. For the main set, these are typically the intervals, so we're going to fall back on the power and the pace. Rate of perceived exertion, well, if the main set is those 15 to 60 second neuromuscular top end power intervals, yes, but typically the main set is going to be those 1 minute to 60 minute either top end FTP or VO2 max or speed or race pace intervals. So power and pace are typically what we're going to go with. Heart rate, again, maybe, but more as a backup when we look after the workout at what our heart rate was during the intervals. For the cool down, I like rate of perceived exertion. All of these other metrics are going to be wildly off from workout to workout because we don't know how smashed up we're gonna be at the end of that workout. So I just like saying rate of perceived exertion, go easy for a cool down. On hills, I really like rate of perceived exertion for this as well because depending on the steepness of the hill, our pace is probably going to be wildly off. Our power might be extremely variable. If you have a really long, gradual, kind of a false flat hill, you could possibly use power, but I do like rate of perceived exertion for those intense hills. And then heart rate, that might be wildly off on hills because your technique is a little bit off, tends to be a little bit more grinding. If it's running, your heart rate is actually going to be really high based on the effort level. So I like to use rate of perceived exertion and power when on hills. Low intensity, we'll hammer this home once again. I really like heart rate, and all of the others, they do tend to lie a little bit. In heat, this is where you're not going to like me very much. A lot of people say, well, what if it's really hot out? Well, I like to fall back on heart rate because when it's hot out, it's very taxing on your body. Your heart rate's going to go up a lot and it's going to be more difficult to do the effort level. So naturally, if we're looking at staying within a low intensity zone, well, we want to keep our heart rate down in the proper zone. So our heart rate is probably going to be a little bit more accurate for the low intensity stuff in the heat. And then finally, for the beginner athlete, I think this is where it all comes down to, let's save you a fair bit of money. The one thing that I really do like for a new athlete is to go with heart rate and rate of perceived exertion. That's going to save you money. You can get a watch and a chest strap for a few $100s. You don't have to get a $1,000 or more power meter that is going to be tremendously expensive, and you haven't actually developed the self-awareness of what your heart rate and what your rate of perceived exertion actually means when it's in conjunction with each other. I personally use heart rate and rate of perceived exertion and then pace a little bit for the first 7 years of my endurance career, and I was hitting podiums. I was like hitting overall podiums, top 3 in local races. And then when I stepped up to longer distances and started working with a little bit more metrics, I had a fallback. I had the ability to look at my rate of perceived exertion and understand, ooh, this is a little bit too hard today. Or get into a race where I remember the Half Ironman World Championships where I went in and I nailed the taper and I was actually able to hold about 15 watts higher on the bike than I was planning on because I had developed that self-awareness in the years prior. So I like for beginner athletes to fall back on heart rate and rate of perceived exertion in the first couple years as you're developing your ability to understand the sensations of training. I know this can be confusing and there's a lot of information, so if you want to like or favorite this and come back, maybe take some screenshots, just look at your phone more frequently and just understand, okay, when I'm doing this type of interval, I should look at this. When I'm doing this type of interval, I should look at this. Maybe that will help you out. Hopefully I haven't confused you. If I have, again, shameless plug for our app, because every single workout in every single session and every single type of workout at every single point of the year has a guideline for what you should be using when, whether it's heart rate, rate of perceived exertion, power, pace, all of those things. It's going to adjust and tell you what the appropriate metric is if you don't have a power meter, if you haven't entered that, for example. So I do really hope that this helps later, motivators. Thank you for watching, motivators. If you're looking for a training plan that incorporates these methods that is as good as a one-on-one coach but as inexpensive as doing it yourself, check out our Motive training app that covers triathlons, running races, duathlons, swim runs, and cycling events. It's a link in the description below where you can check out your customized training plan for free. Also, if you'd rather listen to these tips, we also publish these videos in podcast format on the Taren's Motive Method podcast, so you can check that out. And if you don't want to do either of those things, but you found this video helpful, hit us up with a virtual high five by smashing the like button below. Later, motivators.